and welcome to the Thought Experiment. I'm Jim Barrows. I'll be your moderator tonight. And tonight we have a debate between Mark, Reid, and CJ on the question, does morality come from God? First up is CJ to offer his answer. Then we'll have Mark, Reid offer his. Sit back, relax, and get ready to think. The Thought Experiment starts now.
Where ideas enter the ring.
Welcome, CJ and Mark. CJ. He has not returned from getting his dog. Mark, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Mark Reid. I am an atheist, a secular humanist. I have started this trip through YouTube doing debate, doing discussion, doing conversation. It's been a fascinating ride. I want to also give a big thank you to Skeptic Haven, and thank you so much for CJ for coming to this debate. I would love to get this thing rolling and see if we can have some civil and engaged, passionate debate without the horrendous drama. So that is my hope. But thank you for joining me. This should be fun.
And CJ, if you'd introduce yourself.
Absolutely. My name is CJ Cox. I run the YouTube channel, The Synagogue, as well as a couple others. Synagogue, where we discuss theology and apologetics from what I term a Reformed fundamentalist perspective, meaning I'm a Calvinist and deeply conservative. I've been doing these debates now for a couple of years. We've had Mark actually on the channel a few times during some of our late night open mics. And I'm happy to have a first kind of formal debate with him. This will be hopefully very nice. And happy to make acquaintance with you guys as well. It's the first time on the channel.
Fantastic. Thank you. And tonight our format is going to be 12-minute openings each, 8-minute rebuttal each, 10 minutes of cross-examination each, 20 minutes of discussion, a 5-minute closing, and then we'll give you everyone in chat 30 minutes to ask whatever questions they want of either of our interlocutors. CJ, are you ready?
I am.
Mark, are you ready?
Yeah, let's go.
CJ, the clock starts now.
All righty, thank you. And I just want to say shalom to the audience and thank you all for participating. I know this is primarily a more skeptical channel, but I tend to start these by saying blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I want to thank, of course, Mark for having this conversation with me, as well as Mr. Barrows for hosting, Skeptic Haven for having us platformed here, and all of you for participating and watching. Subject before us today is, does morality come from God? And I want to be somewhat annoying here to many in the audience by saying that this is a generally theistic question. So I'm going to try and have generally theistic answers. I am, of course, not opposed in any way, shape, or form to defending the Bible, but technically this question can be answered in the affirmative by a Hindu, by a Mormon, by a Catholic, by a Muslim. And so I want to try and keep it, in order to make sure we're answering the question itself properly, I want to try and keep it to a more generally theistic platform, if you'll indulge me. There are a couple different arguments that I think we can use for morality coming from God. The first question is, of course, whether or not there's objective morality, right? Whether or not moral values and duties exist in any sort of objective standard. And objective is typically defined as being mind independent or stance independent, something which I don't think actually works for what the theist is actually trying to claim. So I'd like to offer a second new definition, which is to say that morality is unchanging and absolute, but not necessarily stance independent. I think that allows us to consistently ground it in an immutable being, namely God, without not begging the question, but without kind of changing the definition here of what objective actually is. Because the reality is, if we mean entirely stance dependent, theists don't really mean objective morality when they argue for as much. So there are a couple different arguments I think we can get there. One that is incredibly minor is what I term the lawgiver analogy. And a way that we can kind of understand this analogy is by looking at the concept of government, right? So the existence of a law, by which I mean the human law, presupposes the existence of an enforcement mechanism of some kind. Now, you'll notice I did not say the presupposes the existence of a government per se. So, for example, an anarchist could share the position that I'm currently sharing with you. but it simply presupposes the existence of some kind of enforcement mechanism. So if objective moral values and duties are said to exist, I think likewise we can reason from the known to the unknown to say that there must be some sort of enforcement mechanism that exists, and I would argue that that has to be God given the following criteria. Number one, laws are abstract in their very nature. Therefore, the thing which grounds them must not be something that is tangible in so much as that it is bound by time, space, and matter. Number two, laws are understood by persons and by minds only. When we say the law of physics, we're not actually talking about law in the same way that we say criminal law or moral law or something along those lines. Those laws are only understood by and communicated by and followed by persons and minds. Therefore, I think that whatever non-tangible being has to ground these things, or a non-tangible object, if you will, if we wanted to open this to Platonic people, it has to be something that is ultimately personal. It can't be an object. It has to be a being, right? And the third thing is, if it is indeed going to be something that is absolute and immutable, then whatever it is that grounds this also has to be absolute and immutable. Now, if you have something that's not bound by time, space, and matter, something that is personal and something that is immutable, that sounds an awful lot like a monotheistic God. How do we know such a thing might exist? And this is where I get to a second argument, which is C.S. Lewis's universality. Right? If you guys are not familiar with C.S. Lewis's concept of universality, it basically goes something like this. We know that universal moral laws exist because despite varying definitions of what constitutes this or that immorality, every society has the same general moral playbook. A perfect example of this is something like murder. There is vast interpretations regarding what murder actually is. For example, you'll have a rather heinous society such as the Spartans, which does not believe exposing a baby they deem to be weak to be something akin to murder. But they do have a concept of murder, and there are certainly certain persons which you are not legally allowed to kill in their society, much like any other society. So the playbook remains the same. Don't steal, don't murder. In many instances, we can even take it to laws that we consider to be quote unquote more advanced, like things like slavery and rape and stuff like that. The question is the definition and the scope. That is what humans tend to disagree on, and that is something that I think is perfectly reasonable given the vast majority of theistic frameworks. Another quick point I would like to get to here is William Lane Craig's famous argument from moral objective values and duties itself. This argument basically is that if moral values and duties do exist, then, like I said, there must be an adequate foundation for them. This might sound like I'm a little bit of repeating myself, but I think there's a careful nuance that makes this relevant here in this debate. Objective morality seems difficult to ground in purely physical facts. We can't describe it with atoms, with organisms, or with societies. And we can't really explain it by purely evolutionary means either, because a lot of our morals are not actually grounded in purely evolutionary means. In fact, a lot of times they tend to go against purely evolutionary means. For example, things like modesty. One could easily argue that female promiscuity, in so much as dress and stuff like that, is actually quite beneficial for the propagation of the species. And therefore, we would expect a purely Darwinian moral framework to lead societies to not only allow, but enjoy things like skimpy clothing on women and stuff like that. But the vast majority of societies actually tend to go the opposite direction. So it doesn't seem like Darwinian evolution actually offers us a explanation for those sorts of things, right? God as a necessarily existent being and perfectly good personal being provides a ground for objective value and obligation. And since objective moral values and duties, I believe, do exist, God exists as their ultimate, God would have to exist as their ultimate foundation. Or as William Lane Craig puts it, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. There's also an argument from moral obligation also made popular by William Lane Craig, and this is much narrower and in some ways stronger than simply arguing from goodness per se. Moral duties have an authoritative character. You ought not torture an innocent person for amusement, for example, even if you want to, even if society approves, and even if you could benefit from doing so. Obligations normally exist in relation to persons or authorities, though, and laws, of course, as I said earlier, have lawmakers. Promises create obligations between persons, and commands involve commanders and those who are dictated to. An impersonal universe can produce consequences, but it is harder to see how it can issue genuine commands. If moral duties are genuinely binding upon persons, then it stands to reason that a supreme personal moral authority provides a natural explanation for their authority. Now, I will say that this is particularly popular amongst divine command theorists, and I am, in fact, a divine command theorist, but for those who don't necessarily share that persuasion, this may not be the most convincing argument, and I'm talking about the theists in that regard. There's the argument from the is-ought gap made famous by David Hume. He famously drew attention to the transition from statements about what is to statements about what ought to be. Evolution might, for example, explain why humans believe murder is wrong, although I argue that that's maybe not quite as true as he would suggest. And neuroscience might even explain what happens to a brain when I judge murder to be wrong or to be right or what have you. Sociology could potentially tell us why societies might prohibit murder in this or that scenario, but none of those facts alone establish the proposition that you ought not murder. An explanation for something does not actually tell us whether or not it should or should not happen. If reality contains genuine oughts, proponents of this argument, such as myself, will argue that reality must itself contain something beyond morally neutral physical facts, and a perfectly moral God does, in fact, provide that normative foundation. There are a couple other arguments that I want to skip over here because I ended up writing kind of a list of them, and I don't want to just completely gish gallop and bog down Mr. Reid here today. So I'll skip over some and then list a few others here. There's the argument from necessary moral truths. This basically says that some moral propositions appear necessarily true rather than contingently true. A good example of this is, people always go to the extremes, right? Torturing an innocent child or torturing a puppy or something like that for amusement seems wrong. And it seems wrong in every possible world containing the relevant circumstances. In other words, it's not merely prohibited by the conventions of our particular universe. One could imagine an infinite amount of hypothetical universes, and yet one will probably conclude that in each one of those infinite hypothetical universes, torturing an innocent puppy or child for no reason whatsoever other than amusement is wrong. This seems to suggest that moral truths are in some sense necessary. Their ultimate foundation must itself not be contingent if indeed they are necessary, and a necessarily existent and essentially good God is therefore a solid proposition that stands to reason as the appropriate grounds for necessary moral truths. How much time do I have left? 2 minutes? Okay. We'll go ahead then and go to the argument from perfect goodness. This is one that I think will probably end up coming up because it is famously attacked by the Euthyphro dilemma. But classical theism goes further than most of these arguments I've been saying by saying that God decides what by saying God does not decide what morality is, but rather that it is somehow ultimately grounded in his nature. I know some might see this as a contradiction with what I said regarding divine command theory, so let me explain real quick. Divine command theory, in my opinion, explains how we are to understand moral commands to us, not necessarily the ontological nature of morality itself. But on this account, like I said, goodness is ultimately grounded in God's nature. God does not arbitrarily invent goodness, nor does he consult a moral rule book or a divine council or some other being or anything of that nature. Rather, he is necessarily loving, just, rational, and has a necessarily good, in fact, I would go as far as to say perfect nature that constitutes the ultimate standard of goodness. In a way, you could kind of think of this as God is kind of the ultimate platonic object, except instead of being a platonic object, he's more like a platonic being. And that's a rough analogy, but it's one that I hope gets the more philosophically inclined of us to understand what I'm getting at. God's commands express his very nature, and this is important because it actually directly, I think, refutes the Euthyphro dilemma, which is, of course, most famously associated with, I believe, I said of course, but I was going to say, now I have to say believe. I believe it's Euripides, but I could be wrong about that. It's the hedonist guy. It might be Plato even. I don't know. Not relevant. The question is, of course, is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's inherently good? But we can actually answer that it's effectively neither. God commands according to his own nature, and his nature by necessity is good. So these are just a few of the arguments. I actually had about 12 listed here. I hope they're good enough for you guys today, and I'll go ahead and actually, it says time's up, so I don't have any time to yield. Mark, I hope you have a good opening statement for me.
All right, Mark, you ready?
Sorry, just unmuting here. Yeah, I would like to share my screen if that's okay.
CJ, do you have a problem with that? With him sharing his screen?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Not at all.
Okay. As soon as you share your screen, Mark, I will start your timer, if that's okay. Or do you want a second
Yep.
before that?
Just remembering how to do it. That's okay. All good. All good. All good.
There should be a button down at the
There we go.
bottom, share screen,
Yep.
and then I'll
There we go.
put it up when you're ready.
Okay, just let me know when it's up on the screen and we can get going.
It is up.
Okay, fantastic. Good morning, evening, whatever time of day it is for you. Glad I'm here. My name's Mark Reid. Today, I have the pleasure of taking the negative of Does Morality Come From God? Again, I want to thank CJ for doing this debate. I want to thank you for being here, and of course, Skeptic Haven and Jim for moderating and providing this platform where we can have these discussions and debates. So first off, I just want to really quickly go through what is morality. It's incredibly complex. It's one of the most complex topics, so I'll try and get through this pretty fast. These definitions are drawn from Stanford. The first is used to describe the morals of a society, like you say, Japan has these morals, or this society has that morals. But really, we'll be talking about the second definition, which really says what the morality should be, or what it would be, basically in the background, and what is it, rather than describing how morals are implemented in any certain society. Just for a note, I do make a distinction between morals, which is individual standards or an individual code of conduct, and ethics, which is a code of conduct that is over a large group of people or a society. So I do make that distinction, but we can use them interchangeably. So the second definition will be the crux of this debate, but it's sort of the main problem I want to bring up is the problem of moral diversity. Now, there's lots of different religions out there. They all claim to have a morality that comes from God, but that morality varies. The problem with this is that from the outsider's view, or from somebody in an independent to all of these religions perspective, there is no methodology. There is no way to decide which one is actually correct, if any of them. So while all of them claim to have this morality from God, the question is, which God? And of course, I do know that CJ is actually arguing from the Christian God, but I want to point out that this isn't sort of a claim that sits alone against morality doesn't come from any God. In fact, theists sort of will regularly argue over which God actually provides morality and what that morality is. Now, one of the claims that is made by theists a lot is the claim of moral equivalence, sort of that over large populations or different cultures, there are these standard moral facts that they all adhere to. Actually, see, you brought this up in the murder thing. I didn't know he would do that, but it's very interesting. I want to point out that even though there are certain things that are ubiquitous, i.e. not universal, but really happens very frequently, there are standards that are not common to other cultures in some. For instance, my example would be Hindus believing that if you kill a cow, it is a horrible, horrible crime. You will not get that same standard across other cultures. So there are these standards that don't fall across other cultures. So the question will be, why are there such significant differences if a God is providing us with these moral standards? Now, my next argument is the Euthyphro dilemma. It was from Plato's Dialogues. And CJ pointed it out excellently. Does God command something because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? If something is good and a God relays this, the source of morality isn't necessarily coming from God. If what is good is what God commands, then atrocities simply become good by just a God declaring them so. And I'll have more about this in the rebuttal. I don't really want to sort of rebut anything CJ's done in the introduction. So I decided to go in for some challenges to biblical morality. Now, I think it's important, if you ask for what the nature of God is, that you're looking at how he transmits that information to you. And the only way we can see how sort of the nature of God is through the Bible in Christianity. Now, you may appeal to some kind of general revelation, i.e. some experience with a God, But really, from an outsider who is trying to analyze which God is in fact providing morality, the only way to see God's character is through the writings that are about them. This is Exodus 21. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property, which I think we can all agree is pretty immoral. So if that is sort of the commandment, really the question is, what makes that good, or how is that good? Deuteronomy 20, when you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it will be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. This is how you are to treat all cities that are a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. Now, this would probably violate so many laws in the Geneva Convention. It's ridiculous. So again, I would, sort of argue that if that is a moral responsibility handed down by a God, how does that become good, and why is it good? Numbers 15, while the Israelites were in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found them gathering wood brought unto Moses and Aaron the whole assembly. They kept him in custody because it was not clear what should be done with him. Then the Lord said to Moses, the man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp. So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death as the Lord commanded. Now, this one is the Lord basically handing down a sentence directly, a moral judgment. So, I think, again, you really have to explain why somebody gathering wood on the Sabbath day, it's moral to stone them to death. Now, I do want to also provide an alternative origin of morals. I don't want just, have it all focused on CJ's sort of presentation of morality from God. I think that there is a fair case to be made, and one with some evidence to it, that the foundation of morality comes from biological imperatives, evolutionary development, cognitive neuroscience, and psychology which is behavior of organisms within societies. So we've been analyzing moral imperatives. It has been found that mental state attribution, which is necessary for social decision making, relies on a network of interconnected cortical regions. This is the neurology of it. Those regions supporting mental state attribution are co-activated during social decision making, have been mapped by MRI machines to investigate the neural correlates. So we give stimuli or a moral statement or picture that induce emotional reactions. The main difference between these stimuli is the perspective of participants reflecting first-person moral dilemmas or third-person moral reactions. They're tied to biological imperatives. The first one is empathy. That's the ability to understand and emulate the feelings of another. Now, there's a few different types. One's affective empathy, where you basically feel what the other person is feeling. There is a cognitive empathy, where you can rationally understand what somebody is feeling. But I'm really going to focus on affective empathy. That is neurologically triggered through mirror neurons. So it basically is that if you see somebody in pain, you will have the emotional response of pain. Now, it won't be the emotion of the sensory system. It will be the emotional system. So yeah, if you've ever seen, somebody take a shot to the stomach and you go, "Ooh, that's empathy." This mental state sort of prevents intersocietal violence, and it fosters care of weaker members of the society. This is invaluable for a social species, as their strength relies on the individual contribution of all members to a group effort. If you've ever watched a movie and seen somebody, you know, break down in tears or have a triumphant moment and you felt the same, this is those mirror neurons and empathy at work. Now, this isn't just limited to humans. Here we have Jambo, the gorilla. Now, this was a really fascinating thing, and I'll see if I can get it playing here. Whoops, no, I can't get it playing. But this was basically a child fell into Jambo the gorilla's pit. The gorilla basically shielded the child from the other gorillas and tried to care for the child. Sort of, it basically patted him and tried to soothe the child because he understood that the child was upset. When the child woke up and started screaming, he actually sort of herded the rest of the gorillas away from the child, sort of understanding that the child was upset. It's really interesting that this empathy reaction can cross species. Like, for instance, we will all go and rescue dolphins, even though they're not of our own species. But more interestingly, dolphins have been known to rescue humans that have fallen in the water. That empathy does go both ways. And there was an excellent example with a leopard seal that tried to feed a cameraman a penguin, a dead penguin, because it thought that the cameraman was in trouble, and so it was trying to take care of him. It's very fascinating the way it works. Now, I think that if you were to argue that this kind of reaction, this moral reaction of I ought to take care of this child, then you would have to argue that that is somehow provided to Jambo the gorilla by a god. One of the other ones is reciprocity. Now, reciprocity is the sense given for the same reward for the same action. Like, for instance, if you are doing the same work as someone else and you find out you're really underpaid in relation, that sense of objection to that is reciprocity. It gives the foundation to a sense of fairness and equality, that things ought to be reciprocated by members of society. To put it basically, it's the feeling of satisfaction when a cake is distributed and shared equally. That is reciprocity. And we do observe that in animals as well. So we have here the capuchin monkey experiment. Now, I wish this would play because it's actually a hilarious video. Basically, the capuchin monkey, they have to return a stone to the researcher's hand. One, when they return a stone, gets a cucumber, which they don't mind. They will eat. So the first time that monkey gets the stone, he eats the cucumber.
Mark,
But yeah.
your time is up.
Okay, no problem.
All right, and
It's
now
always way too fast, isn't it?
yeah. Time for 8-minute rebuttals each. We'll go in the same order. CJ, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Begin.
All right. So thank you, Mark, for that opening statement. It was definitely clearly well researched. So I appreciate you coming in there with some very interesting facts for us to discuss. I want to start with the problem of moral diversity. I kind of hinted at this a little bit when I talked about another way of understanding this, which is the evidence from moral universality. The claim was essentially all religions claim to have morality, but they disagree on which is true. And then there was the question, how does one understand which God is the one who gives morality? And I think there are two important points for us to make in this regard. The first is that while all religions do tend to have various amounts of disagreement, in fact, speaking of the aforementioned C.S. Lewis, he actually talks about this for a couple pages in his Abolition of Man. It is true that there are disagreements if one compares, for example, Sharia law to Catholic canon law, to the Torah, to, I believe it's called Dharma in Hinduism, but I'm no expert in Hinduism, and so on and so forth. But one also finds an incredibly interesting amount of direct parallels. I will once again reference the murder example. There is no society in the world that believes that murder is wrong or is not wrong. There are simply societies which do not agree with what the definition of murder actually is. We actually have a clear example of this in our own modern Western culture. We all agree that murder is wrong, save for some random sociopath out there. But there is genuine question in our societies regarding, for example, whether or not it is murder to abort a child, or whether or not it is murder to bomb a civilian population if one is at war. Whether or not it's murder to shoot somebody who is attacking you but is not armed, right? so on and so forth. There's agreement about the law itself. Murder is wrong. There's disagreement about the details regarding the law itself. And one will find this generally true regarding the vast majority of moral propositions. For example, theft, for example, rape, for example, property crimes, for example, even animal cruelty, and so on and so forth. There is universality regarding the principles themselves. There is diversity regarding the application of the principles themselves. And I think that argues for a ultimate single source of morality that is interpreted differently throughout different cultures. To the question, the second point is to the question of how one understands which God is the one who gives morality. I don't think our question today is actually meant to answer that question. The reality is a Muslim could take my position right now and I think be able to argue roughly the same points that I'm arguing here today. A Hindu could do the same, particularly theistic Buddhist strands could do the same, and so on and so forth. The question of whether or not God grounds morality or a God grounds morality is ultimately different than the question which God grounds that morality, right? To give an example again with my anarchism thing, right? We could say that the existence of a law presupposes the existence of a mechanism for enforcing that law without saying, therefore, a monarchy exists in this land, or a republic exists in this land, or even an anarchistic society exists in this land, right? So those are ultimately separate questions. And I think in order to be very clear regarding the question we're asking today, we should stick to the more generally theistic questions, which is why I want to very briefly also mention biblical morality. We brought up, slavery, the Deuteronomy 20 commands, which he said that he would probably violate numerous Geneva codes, execution for Sabbath breaking in Numbers 15. All incredibly interesting and all things I've actually spoken with Mark at length about, but all things which I think are generally not relevant to the question as formulated in this debate. Now, I want to be clear, they are relevant moral questions. And in fact, I would be perfectly willing to have a stricter debate on this issue regarding biblical morality, because I think that actually could be a good deal more interesting. Not that these debates are not interesting, of course, I quite like philosophy. But ultimately, if we say, and you can actually take an example of this, say there was a one ruler to rule them all. And by ruler, I mean the measuring stick, right? There was one ruler to rule them all. And that ruler has 12 of what we would consider standard inches, constituting 1.5 feet. Obviously, that's not the real world. This is just a thought experiment, right? If somebody were to say, well, if that's true, then our standard foot is wrong, the answer to that question would be, well, yes, actually, that's exactly correct. But to argue with the standard on the basis that it is, in fact, a standard is no argument at all. Likewise, if we are able to prove, or at least to come to a reasonable conclusion, that a God does ground morality, if the objection is, well, if this particular God grounds morality, then this, and that ends up being moral or immoral, the answer is quite simply, yes, that's exactly right. I would call that almost a tautological statement. The standard is the standard by definition, right? Euthyphro dilemma, morality can't come from God if he commands it, because that would mean that if he commands it because it is good, rather, because that would mean that goodness exists outside of him. And it is arbitrary if it's based solely on his whim. Correct, unless, as I said in my opening statement, there is a third possibility for why God commands it, namely that it is grounded in his own personal nature, right? So this is why I said I would describe my divine command theory as thus. Human beings understand morality in its clearest form by way of commands from God, and whatever he says goes. But those commands are ultimately grounded in an immutable nature, which I believe he has shared with all of us by making us in his image. But to be fair, that's a little bit more specific than what I'm trying to get to today, being a strictly biblical claim. So I'll leave that to the side for a moment and just say that morality is grounded in an immutable nature that is God's. Therefore, it's not coming from without him. He is commanding it because it is good, but at the same time, it is not based solely on an arbitrary whim. His nature is actually inherently good. Or we could word it another way and say his nature is inherently what it is, and we understand goodness the way we understand it because we are created by this being. A couple other points here regarding naturalistic morality, which I do find very interesting. Firstly, I'd like to say that I do not deny in any way, shape, or form that animals are capable of understanding a rudimentary and primitive form of morality. In fact, I think that's how we manage to have pets, My dogs may not understand exactly why what they're doing is immoral if they do something that is immoral, but they do understand that it makes dad mad. And so they will listen to me whenever I yell and hey, don't do that. Don't chase the squirrel or chase the cat or whatever it happens to be. So there's clearly some level of understanding, even if it's as primitive as a understanding of authority. So I don't want to actually reject that, but what I do want to reject is this idea that naturalism and evolution can explain the development of morality. For example, we had this claim that social decision-making seems to be greatly benefited by empathy, and empathy is something that is found in virtually all social creatures. That is true. Empathy does not necessarily tell you whether or not a thing is right or wrong. Good example that's in the news right now. We had the Lindsay Clancy case where she is said to have murdered her 3 children. Very many people feel empathy for her because she was on SSRIs and may have potentially been suffering from postpartum psychosis. Does that actually tell us whether or not what she did is right or wrong? No, it doesn't. And does it actually tell us whether or not she should be held morally accountable for what she did? Well, again, no, it doesn't. It simply suggests that there's something within us that is empathetic towards these creatures. And this goes back to the is-ought issue. Describing things the way they are does not actually give us imperatives regarding the way things should be, right? Reciprocity also is something that actually, I'll save that for a moment. It looks like my time is up. Floor is yours.
All right, thank you, CJ. Mark, are you ready?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, start now.
So the whole idea of sort of not defending the Bible, I get what you're saying, that it's not technically about morality in the Bible, and I do acknowledge that. But I think that then you have to, in some way, explain how that morality, how that code of conduct is transmitted to people. So I think that sort of, if you are sort of saying, hey, it comes from their nature, but we're not going to look at the Bible for that code of conduct, I think that that would be sort of counter to what I've heard from most Christians on how to behave, and B, then I'm not sure how that code of conduct is actually transmitted, because it does not seem to be transmitted by any sort of personal interaction with a God. It seems to be pointed towards the Bible at that point, or towards some text, as you mentioned. There's the Bhagavad Gita, there's the Quran and things like that. Your lawgiver analogy, I don't know why we would presuppose that morals have some kind of moral giver. I think that I'm a moral anti-realist. I'm a meta-ethical relativist. So I don't think there is objective morality. So all of the sort of objections that if morality is objective, well, I don't think it is. So that really doesn't apply to me. I agree laws are abstract. I think that morals are sort of abstract as well. But my position is that we have certain meta-ethical goals that we want to achieve, and either our actions line up with those or they do not. Sort of C.S. Lewis, the universality, the whole idea that the scope changes, I don't think that's true. But when you're looking at any moral decision, you're looking at what we ought to do. So if you think that self-defense is fine, you would definitely have a different moral stance at the end of the day about whether somebody that defended their home with a shotgun should be prosecuted for murder or not. So this is a moral distinction that does not appear to be universal. And there have been civilizations in the past that have, as you pointed out, the Spartans exposed babies and things like that, which we would certainly say is a way different moral standard than we have. So I don't think that's a really good objection to the idea of moral diversity, because if there was a one sort of ruler that handed down morality, like, for instance, if you have gravity, that is something that every single civilization will find to be the same. There's no sort of gravity that it has a different scope over in Japan that it does in sort of America. So I think that is sort of just it's not really addressing the issue of why the morals diverge so heavily. Sort of talking about a Darwinian moral framework, I don't think that's particularly good analogy. Like a Darwinian is usually interpreted a bit sort of simply when people talk about that kind of thing. Oh, I've got to move. I don't think moral duties necessarily exist, only in the context of ethical duties within a society. I'm not sure that moral duties do, so that doesn't really apply to me. Now, Hume's guillotine applies to a god as well. Just because you have a god and just because they hand down through divine command theory or through some other mechanism that they are good, it still poses the question of why ought we actually follow the god. If it is just that they will punish you and have all the power in the universe, then to me that makes a might makes right system. So it's sort of fascinating that Hume's guillotine, it really does apply to any is, getting an ought from any is, including that God is the one to hand this down, therefore you should do what he says. Let's see. Yeah, so the sort of argument from sort of perfect goodness, it's if God doesn't decide where it comes from his nature, and his nature is unchanging, then it will be interesting to see why morality changes so much over the years. It seems to me that it seems to be a sort of ad hoc explanation to sort of say, well, we're getting towards the morality of God, but it is unchanging, even when sort of described in the holy text that he does things that we would consider immoral. So with the Euthyphro dilemma, if it does come from his nature and we all act in accordance with our nature, then why would that not make the actions that God did in the Bible moral things to do, unless you're not actually getting it from God's nature? And is God subject to I'll save that one for the cross exam. I think I'm about done.
You've got 2 minutes and 40 odd seconds.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right. 10 minutes of cross-examination each. CJ, are you ready to begin your cross-examination?
Yes, sir.
All right. Let me get my, there. All right. Then you may begin.
All right, thank you. So I want to start with the definition of abstract, which is an idea, quality, or thought that exists in the mind without any physical or touchable shape. It is considered the antonym of concrete. Would you, first of all, before I move forward with a question based off of that, would you agree with that definition?
Yeah, sure. Yep.
Okay. So just as a quick list, this would include things like morality, love, maybe we could say currency, maybe numbers, things like that. Would you agree that all of these count as abstracts, or at least that that's the general idea when we're discussing abstracts, these non-tangible things?
I'm not sure about love. I think love's a feeling, which we sort of is a sort of product of neurology rather than a mental state. So I think that I would agree that laws are abstract, ideas are abstract, but I'm not sure about a feeling like love.
Okay. Maybe to be a little bit more general, we could say numbers, properties, and concepts, right? That we could call those abstracts. Okay.
Sure.
So if abstracts are defined as things which exist only in the mind, or as, they don't have any physical or touchable nature to them. Well, actually, let me ask you another question before I get there. You would, if I understand your moral anti-realism correctly, you would say that abstracts are not ultimately grounded in any, whether earthly or otherwise, physical thing, right? Like you don't believe in platonic objects or a god or anything like that, right?
No, but I think that, so whether thoughts are physical, well, that's different than an abstraction. So a thought is a physical thing because it's comprised of, electricity across neurons, chemicals involved and things like that. The brain is very complex. But the concept itself that the thought provides isn't physical at all. So I would liken it to Super Mario is a character that exists, on bits of data somewhere, but the concept that we have of Super Mario being a plumber that does, jumps on something, that isn't physical itself.
Okay. And I appreciate that analogy. Would it be fair to say, given that analogy, that Mario exists in so much as that he exists, like you said, as bits of data in a code, but that in any tangible way of speaking, Mario does not genuinely exist. Would that be fair?
The concept of Mario exists, but it's only an abstraction. But it doesn't exist in reality. That concept doesn't exist in reality. Yeah.
So then my question regarding abstracts is, given the rejection of morality as objective and the definition of abstract, what is the difference between saying morality is an abstraction that does not exist in reality and simply saying morality does not exist?
It's because we've got basically certain objective ways to reach our goals. So if I have a goal of being nice to CJ, right? Like that's my goal. Attacking you with a lead pipe will not get me to that goal. If my, and that isn't to do with it being an abstraction. That's a very physical thing I would do. So it's not a case where you can sort of say, well, it's all just abstraction, because I don't think it's abstract whether I provide you with cheesecake or hit you with a lead pipe. That is, that's not abstract.
Yeah, but certainly the command element of that, or if we would like to be more careful, the principle element of that, I should be nice to CJ, that is an abstract, right? In so much that it really only exists in Mark's mind.
Sure.
So then what's the difference in saying goodness towards my fellow man only exists in my mind and saying goodness to my fellow man as an ought does not exist?
What do you mean it does not exist?
So that is to say that, like, if we are saying that morality is an abstraction and that it only exists in the same way that Super Mario exists, which is to say that it does not exist in reality, why can we not just cut off the in reality aspect there and say morality simply does not exist?
Well, it's because that it is an abstraction, sure, but it's not like the way that system works is not in society at all. I get what you're saying, and that's why I'm sort of saying I'm a moral anti-realist, right? I don't think that morality exists in the real world. I think it only exists conceptually in virtue of what our goals are.
Okay. So then, given that, how do you decipher between two? And we're going to go with societies, because individuals, I think, is very easy. You have courts that can arbitrate. What's the word I'm looking for? Courts can provide arbitration for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, arbitrate, exactly. Thank you. So let's look at societies then. How does one arbitrate between societies that have fundamentally different goals if morality is merely goal oriented? For a clear example of this, what allows us to say that Nazi Germany and Tojo's Japan were actually morally wrong beyond anything that is just like, well, we have decided that they are wrong and therefore they are?
Well, it's really difficult. And we've got a long history of it being incredibly difficult to get other people from seeing our moral point of view. With the case of Nazi Germany, I think you could say that even under their own objective, their intention to establish a 1,000-year Reich and rule over the entire world, the actions that they were taking were not going to get them to that eventuality because of the way the rest of the world responded, because of the way that all fascist systems collapsed within about 40 years or so. That's the longest we've ever seen. So I think that even under their own goals, they were immoral because it wouldn't get them to their goal. But I think that you're sort of saying, what makes my goal better than theirs? And I think the only way to do it is to appeal to the people about what they want the outcome to be. To sort of go, well, if you do want there to be a flourishing society where people are respected, this will not get you to that goal.
So, and funnily enough, this is just a little aside, but I'd actually even quibble with the 40-year because I don't think Franco's the one they usually give for that. I don't actually think Franco counts as a fascist. He's more of authoritarian military dictatorship, but that's neither here nor there. So to your point, fascism does fail very quickly. But the fascist ideal of conquest is actually far more common throughout history than our modern ideal of sort of live and let live, as evidenced by the Mongols. And I heard a joke once of somebody saying that it's very interesting we see Hitler the way we do, not because we're wrong, but because we don't see Alexander the same, which I find to be a little bit fascinating, right? But the reason I bring that up is to say, given two societies with equal commitment from their populations, and this is a thought experiment, of course, right? Equal commitment from their respective populations. One has a morality much more akin to yours and mine, which, you know, United States and Australia is going to be fairly similar in that regard. It's both Western civilization, right? And one's going to have a morality more akin to that sort of primitive and classical ideal of conquest, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me like the only way to decipher between those two is which one wins on the battlefield. How would you respond to that?
Well, that seems to be the case sometimes, and that is sort of what we want to try and avoid. But I think that the problem is that people want to say, well, if we acknowledge that there is no sort of background moral standard, objective moral standard, then we have to go to war and fight somebody whose morals conflict greatly with ours. And we try to avoid that, but that seems to be what happens in a lot of cases. And so sort of what I want to do is acknowledge what I think is true, not what I want to be true. Because if it were true that there was a moral standard handed down, we wouldn't have these disagreements that we'd have to fight over. But as I said, that the ideal way is to somehow relay to that civilization that what they are doing will lead to a certain outcome that they don't want. And the problem usually isn't people. People are more or less, you know, trying to get on with their lives and you know, just they want a comfortable life. It's usually the people in power that are the problem, that, you know, really aren't interested in human flourishing. They're interested in their own power. And, you know,
So,
I would say that Australia and America have been guilty of that as well.
and certainly every nation to some extent, no doubt there.
Sure.
My last question then would just be to say, is it fair to say that given your system of morality, might really does make right?
I hate to interrupt you on that important question. Mark,
right.
if you wish, you can answer. It's
Yeah,
up
yeah,
to
I'd love
you.
to.
Okay.
Yeah, as I said, because even if Germany was the, you know, authority in Germany at that time, even if they had the most might, because their actions would not lead to their goals, that was immoral. So it's not a case of might makes right. But you know, at the end of the day, whoever's meta-ethical goal wins. You know, I think that there is a case to be made that you know, people do enforce what they want through might, and I think that's wrong. But I do not see that being handed down as a objective standard. And in the past, it does seem like, you know, the winners have written history. So, but in order to get a functioning society that we all will enjoy living in, that's a terrible way to get the society that I want.
Okay. All right, Mark, it is your turn. Are you ready?
Yes, I am ready.
Your time starts now.
Okay, so is God's nature immutable? Is that unchanging?
Yes, I would argue yes.
Right, and morality comes from his nature.
Yes.
Okay, do you think God acts within his nature?
It's an interesting question because, to be real with you, theologians have debated that. I'm going to go ahead and say yes for simplicity's sake.
Okay.
But it's fairly debated how much we can anthropomorphize God in classical theism.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. So if God acts within his nature, why is his acts seen as immoral when, you know, you take it from the Bible? Why is his actions seen as immoral, even though his actions are inside of his nature?
Well, I would argue that there's 2 points. The first point I would say is if a monotheistic creator God exists, then kind of by definition, he can't be immoral, being that he's the standard from which moral comes from. Now, that could mean some horrible things if God decided that he was going to just laugh every second of the day while telling you that only the purple panda born on the 4th Tuesday of the 13th month could go to heaven like a maniac. He could do that, and you couldn't say anything because he would be the standard. So to an extent, there is in my opinion, a sort of presuppositional question of the monotheistic creator God is not capable of being immoral if indeed he is seen as the standard. Now, beyond that, I think what you're getting at is, why is it that we see something, for example, like Numbers 15, as immoral,
Right.
if the creator ultimately has spread his morality across the world in some way, shape, or fashion? And I would just simply say that I think that we ourselves have a very deficient idea of what morality is. And I don't mean we as in you and I per se, but I mean we as in the human race, which is part of the reason why I think we tend to disagree with each other so often regarding what is and is not immoral. So I think a plain example of this from a theistic standpoint might be something like, we tend to today argue about whether or not divorce is immoral. Now, if my God exists and truly is the standard of morality, then it just simply is immoral. And those who disagree with me just simply are wrong, in the same way 2 + 2 = 5 is wrong. But that would not mean that that law was wrong. It would simply mean that there was a segment of the population that did not recognize the facts as they are. Now, of course, whether or not those are the facts is another question, but I presume you might want to get there at some point.
Well, I really want to focus on how that nature is transmitted into your morality, right? Because really I'm asking about your morality and where that comes from. So like really looking at the entire transmission of God's nature to a human being. So my question would be, how is that nature transmitted through the Bible? How do you gain a sense of what you should do if some of the things in the Bible, like that Numbers passage, is immoral for you but moral for God?
So that's actually a good question. So I would say, in terms of the transmission point, I think that morality is most clearly transmitted via God's commands, which is why I'd call myself a divine command theorist. And
Right.
that would mean, of course, whichever particular holy text happens to be correct. Obviously, as a Christian, I would take the Bible as that holy text. So that's where we would get our clearest understanding of morality. I would also consider myself a natural law theorist. And so I would say that morality is, while more vague, can be understood through certain natural principles that Confucius may come to in the same way that Heraclitus may come to, in the same way that I may come to, just simply by our reasoning, which is why I think morality over time tends to look more and more like what we understand today, which I would also add, I think is very heavily influenced by the Christian worldview itself. Just as a clear example of that, I think the concept of the equality of persons tends to be a very Christian concept that, for whatever reason, the vast majority of civilizations in the world did not actually agree with some exceptions for sure. It's not like this is an entirely uniquely Christian phenomenon. And then the third point I would want to add there is, it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like part of what you're asking is, why is it okay for God to do a thing, but not okay for you to do a thing if morality is ultimately grounded in God's nature? And I think the answer to that is there is a secondary element which we haven't actually considered yet, which is authority. God has the authority to do things that might not be right for you or I to do. And authority as a means to transmit moral rightness and wrong, or a means to communicate moral rightness and wrongness, is something we kind of intuitively understand already. The best example I can think of being that it is okay for me to watch like The Backrooms, which is a horror movie that just came out. But if I show that to my 15-month-old, that might not be a good idea, right? It might be immoral for him to see that. It could mess with his little mind. It might be immoral for me to even show that to him. A clearer example than that could even be, it's moral for a police officer. Suppose that I was in here committing some heinous crime. It would be moral for a police officer to come in here armed with lethal force, kidnap me, and put me in a room once the law decides that I am guilty. But if I were to do the same thing, even if the person in question was committing the same heinous crime, that would actually be an immorality. I don't have the right to kidnap people and lock them in rooms for a predecided period of time, regardless of how heinous their crime is. So we do kind of intuitively recognize there is something to this concept of authority, where one authority may actually have a right to do things that somebody in a lesser position of authority does not actually have a right to do.
Well, then I would ask, then how are you getting it from God's nature instead of the transmission of what God commands is good, or commands you to do is what is good? Why doesn't the same principle of the Euthyphro apply, that tomorrow he could decide that, hey, you need to do all of this murdering in order to be good, if he can change from his nature through this lens of authority to what you need to do to be moral?
Well, so I would argue that this isn't actually a change in him, right? In other words, God. So to use the Bible as an example, it speaks frequently about how God gives and takes away life, right? And I would just suggest that this is always a quality which God has. He is the sole, and as a Calvinist, I can even say he is the sole giver of life and the sole taker of life, because everything, I think, is in some sense ordained by him, right? For those who don't know, Calvinism is predeterministic, so I'm a predeterminist. So I wouldn't argue that this is a change in God's morality. And I would also go further in saying that hierarchy and authority are actually things which naturally arise from out of God's nature. I do have to break my own rule here a little bit. So if you want to push on this being more specific to the scripture, that's to the Bible, I should say, that's fine. Because this is something I think is particularly strong in Christian theism, when we have a Godhead. There is a eternal hierarchy between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that does not ever change. The Son, despite being eternally God, is always submitted to the Father, in past and future and in all other times. So, and again, if you want to press on the Bible, given that I just broke my own rule, that's perfectly fine. But the point there is to say hierarchy and authority are something that are also in kind of an intuitive part, or not intuitive, but a necessary part of God's nature.
Well, I guess I will sort of just push back on the idea that if a God has an unchanging nature, a God acts within his nature, which you've both granted, a God acts to do something. Why is it then that that is immoral for you if you are getting it from their nature? Why isn't that contradictory?
Because I think that there is, I'm kind of going to be reiterating a little bit, to be honest with you. I think that concept of authority does genuinely change who ought to behave in a certain manner. So it's not that, if we were to take that kidnapping example, it's not that the law of kidnapping has actually changed. And let's just assume for a moment that morality is objective, just for sake of a thought experiment. It's not as if the society has come to some conclusion that kidnapping is actually okay. We've simply recognized there are people in positions of authority who, given certain circumstances, don't have to abide by that rule. In this case, the person is committing a heinous crime and a warrant happens to be for this person's arrest. That police officer is allowed to effectively kidnap that person and lock them away for a very long period of time with the help of a judge and so on.
Hold on, Jay. Just to return, because I'm not sure if you, like, I might have misphrased the question. What I'm sort of saying, if God commands people to do things that are immoral in the Old Testament, and that is within his nature to do those things, why is it now immoral if he has commanded it? Morality is his nature, and his nature is unchanging.
So if I'm understanding correctly, I'm going to take the example of like the Canaanites. If I understand you correctly,
Right.
you're saying
Yep.
something along the lines of genocide is wrong, but God commanded the wiping out of entire civilizations. Why is that right? Is that roughly what you're saying?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So I think that in that circumstance, if we grant that God has a right to punish his creation as he sees fit, the mechanism by which the mechanism he uses to accomplish that punishment is not, I think, immoral for abiding by his commands in punishing that person. And to get to the reason I bring that kidnapping example in, right, is it's not like the don't kidnap people law violates what the police officer is doing. We're simply saying if the government has a right to punish whatever the criminal is doing, then the police officer is not somehow violating that kidnapping law by effectively doing what we would call kidnapping. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah, I think my time's up.
Yeah. Yeah. And however, we have begun the 20-minute discussion. So if you guys are both ready, I will start that timer hearing yes from both of you.
Yep.
I'm good.
All right, here you go. And you can pick up right where you left off.
Yeah, so I think that when you look at sort of getting, like, if morality is grounded in God's nature and God's nature is unchanging, and I do like your example where, you know, you wouldn't let a young child watch a horror movie, but it's fine for you because of the different circumstances, kind of thing. I think that a God commanding people like ages ago to do something that we would say is immoral now, it doesn't make sense that that's grounded in an unchanging nature, because that would still be moral. And I understand what you mean about authority, but really what I'm pushing back on is that you get your standard of morals from God's nature and not what God tells you to do, if that makes sense.
Well, and so that does make sense, actually. And I think it's important for me to make a qualification here, which I did kind of say in the openings, but I don't know if I spent a very short period of time on it, so I don't know if I said it that clearly. Morality, I think, does ultimately derive from God's nature, but I think it is best understood and most clearly understood by his commands. So what I mean by that is that if we were to look at the ultimate source, is it simply his whim, or is it something outside of him or something like that? The ultimate source is the nature that he has. And while we could say, you know, he might transmit it by natural means or by the Imago Dei or something like that, the clearest way in which I, as a human being, understand that nature is by way of the things that he commands me. Now, how can we apply that to something that we might consider to be immoral that happens in the Old Testament? Well, the first thing is, and this is probably my most controversial opinion of the evening, I would not consider what Joshua and the Israelites did to be immoral if we assume that God genuinely exists and that he genuinely did command them to do what they did. Which, by the by, if somebody wants to say, okay, so if somebody thinks they're being commanded by God to do X, I want to say, no, scratch that. In the thought experiment, we are saying we know for certain that God really exists and really did command Joshua to do those things. If that is the case, I don't think what he did would be immoral. And hypothetically speaking, if something along those lines were to happen today, I don't think that that would necessarily be immoral either. And I also think there is a smaller scale example of this. I don't know how you feel about the death penalty. Personally, I am for it. And that's kind of a smaller scale example of exactly this. We do know, given the commands from the Bible, and I would say given natural law as well, that justice is punitive by nature and that we have a moral obligation to punish wrongdoers. You can kind of see this in like the Genesis 9:6 command, right? It says, whosoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Well, inherent in that is an apparent contradiction, because whoever sheds man's blood shall have his blood shed by man, but then what happens to the man who just shed his blood, right? Well, that contradiction is
violence.
Yeah, right. That contradiction.
Yeah, so I think that's another debate we can have, because I am firmly against the death penalty, but maybe not, because really my goal of what I think justice should be accomplishing, like your goal, is obviously punitive. We should punish people for what they've done wrong. I would say that a rehabilitative justice works better to stop crime. That's been proven. Anyway, we're getting sidetracked on a completely different debate, but this is what I'm sort of saying on oughts are based on what we want to accomplish. And, you know, I think that when you have a God that sort of, you know, the problem of evil raises its head, like when the God sort of does all of these diseases and all of this, provides all of this suffering. So therefore that's within his nature. So it does, like, I'm not arguing that, you know, God couldn't have done this thing and still be moral. That's God. But like, I'm really pushing back on that. You then get your morality from that God's nature. because if you are simply copying God's nature, it is within his nature to destroy cities and, put plagues on people and do all of this stuff. So I think that with Joshua and the destruction of the Canaanite tribes, I don't think that is a moral thing. Sorry, I'm sort of wandering a bit. I do apologize. But really,
No, you're
I'd
right. I
like
did the
to
same.
ask, how do you determine whether God has given instructions to somebody or not? What methodology do you have to say that, the Japanese cult that released sarin gas into the subway wasn't in fact commanded by God to do so?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would say that I think that and this gets a little bit more into apologetics regarding the Bible itself. I do think the Bible has certain mechanisms for proving itself. The historical resurrection of Jesus, I think, can be demonstrated. I think there are prophecies in the Bible that can be demonstrated. They're kind of outside of the scope of tonight's debate a little bit, which is unfortunate because that really is the answer to your question. Is I think there are good arguments for the veracity of God as revealed in the Bible, and I think there are poor arguments for the veracity of God as revealed in the Quran, for example. In terms of like Joshua specifically, I think one of the key distinctions, assuming both stories are as true as we could assume them to be, I guess we can't assume them both be true at the same time because they are kind of mutually exclusive. But let's take the Japanese cult and Moses at the same time, right? If the Moses story is true, then however many thousands of Israelites were there at Mount Sinai actually saw God just like he did, right? They saw him go up to Mount Sinai. They saw him split the Red Sea. They saw the plagues, all those other sorts of things. There's a much greater amount of evidence, a much greater degree of evidence for those people than in the Japanese cult, whose name I forget, but I do remember the one you're talking about. It's the guy who's like, I think he said he was Jesus's brother or something, but the long-haired, bearded guy who let out the sarin gas in the subway system. You're really just kind of taking his word for it, even at that place in time, provided that his story is perfectly accurate. I still, as one of his followers, have no way to verify it, even if I lived with him, right? So you can kind of see, assuming both stories are true, if I lived in Moses's day, I can verify what Moses said. But if I live in this Japanese cult leader's day, I actually can't verify anything that he said unless he gives me some mechanism of demonstrating it. Maybe he works a miracle, maybe he prophesies some event that can't actually take place. So I think that is in terms of the people at that place in time, is at least an explanation for why we can look at each as being different. Then you add on top of that the certain biblical apologetics, like I think the Bible does prove itself to be historically valid, does prove itself to be prophetically true, and so on and so forth, internally consistent, all these other sorts of things. I don't think you could say that for things like the Quran or the Talmud is famously contradictory, and I say that as an ethnic Jew. It's built in, right? It's a commentary on the Bible, so you have people arguing with each other on the same page.
Well,
Anyway.
I think that the Bible is contradictory, especially to some theist claims, and that's not this debate. But sure, I do. But I know that the average Islamic person would say that the Quran doesn't contradict itself, and it doesn't require these people to be actually see a miracle, because people can be fooled. They can be wrong. They can think they see a miracle. That this mental state does occur, and to sort of say, well, if you believe that you've seen a miracle and it's on par with the parting of the Red Sea kind of thing, then anything you're commanded to do is moral. I think that that's a very dangerous route to go to. That in some way we have to say that you cannot do this, even if you think it is a genuine miracle from God. And sort of what I'm hearing from you is that a person, if they think that they've seen a genuine miracle from a God, and that God commands them, or their representative, because God didn't command the Israelites to do anything, it was relayed through Aaron and Moses, that they should do that because it is moral. I think that is it leads to a lot of tragedies that we've seen, where people have ended their children because they think that God has told them to, or they think that a miracle has occurred, and then they deny insulin to their child because the representative of God tells them to. I think that's a really worrying thing that sort of you would consider sort of genocide to be a moral thing, at least from the perspective of a person that thinks that a God has shown them some sort of miracle.
Well, let me ask you, suppose that you were, because I understand this idea of the transmission, but I also think that's part of where if the story is taken at face value, there is a significant strength to it. And also I think there's good evidence for it, but that's another conversation. Suppose you were in the crowd. You have just witnessed the 10 plagues in Egypt already, including things that genuinely cannot be explained, like Moses somehow turning the river into blood, or miraculously only every person who was first in the lineage dying, with the exception of those with lamb's blood on their doorpost, right? You've already seen some fairly amazing things, and then you watch this massive lake. And bear in mind, there's no modern technology or anything along those lines. You watch this, I guess the Red Sea is not a lake, but you get my point, just split open to such an extent that you could walk right through it. Now, I understand the idea of like, okay, somebody thinks they've witnessed a miracle of God, but assuming that's what you saw, don't you think it'd be reasonable to say, no, I'm fairly certain I know I've seen a miracle from God. These are things that even with our modern technology in 2026 are just frankly impossible, right?
Well, I mean, there has been sort of some speculation that the parting of the Red Sea is just a story about Moses choosing the low tide where you can actually walk across part of the Red Sea. Like that this thing is not the miracle that we think it is. And I think there is a lot of credence given to that by going through the desert, having food drop from heaven, divine food drop from heaven. You wander in the desert, you're brought to a place, and instantly you're off worshiping another god. I think that if they did go through this experience of seeing genuine miracles, that they would not forget the God in like 5 minutes after arriving at their destination, which apparently they did. So I think that as far as miracles go, I don't think those were actually that miraculous by the people just going, well, we're going to go off and worship this other golden calf. I do want to, I'll let you respond, but I do want to bring up the Exodus and the creeping death, the firstborn child dying as well, because that's a really good point. But go ahead, CJ.
Yeah, well, so I would just simply say, well, I can understand that from a naturalistic perspective, and I would even go as far as to say, because I have a unique view regarding legends in history, that were I an atheist, I might even subscribe to that view, because I tend to believe legends do have an origin in something genuine. But for sake of argument, assume that the story is accurate as told and you were in that crowd, right? In that scenario, would it not be fair for Mark to reason in his own mind, I know for a fact I have seen things which just simply cannot be explained by mere human reasoning. I have this death of the firstborn, this water to blood, assuming it's real blood, the splitting of the Red Sea. And again, taking the story at face value. So for the thought experiment, we're assuming it is true. In that instance, I do think that's qualitatively different than if I today were to say, hey, Mark, I think God just talked to me and told me something. It's like, okay, well, I mean, that just might have been a dream, CJ. You don't actually know that, right? Like assuming the veracity of both stories, one of them does seem to have a greater evidentiary weight to it than the other, right?
Well, no, because there is there's a leader called Baba. I can't remember their name, but they're basically this sort of Hindu adjacent leader, and hundreds and thousands of people will attest to having seen his miracles, healing people, miraculous things happening, and we don't necessarily believe them because they are part of a group that already attests. They claim that he's a reincarnation of a previous, I can't remember the name, Baba Sayed, I believe their name is. And you can talk to people who will claim to have seen their miracles today, but I don't believe them because I think that they.
Sorry, if I may, I think that's slightly different than what I'm asking. I'm saying if you were in the crowd and you yourself witnessed the splitting of that sea, let's take two different marks, right? These are two hypothetical marks.
Yeah, no, I get you, but what really, am I the Mark that I am now, the skeptical Mark that would say, hey, I need to investigate before I attribute, like, I don't know how this happened, because that would be my reaction today. Like, I mean, we don't really have the technology to split the Red Sea now, or at least it would be an incredible endeavor. I think that I would say, hey, as a skeptic, I need to investigate and find the cause, rather than just to attribute it to what the guy with the staff is telling me, right? Like, because people can be sort of, fooled, and I know I can be fooled, right? So, but if I lived in that time and I wasn't, but then I wouldn't be me. You know what I mean? Like, I would be a person of that time who's unfamiliar with stage magic and, these things that people can do to make it look like something has happened, like a building has vanished, but in fact has not.
I think that's a fair answer. I would say, for me personally, I think that in evaluating the different miraculous claims, and I've studied significantly, for example, William Branham, who is a supposed prophet from the 1950s and 60s. And
Right.
there are some genuinely interesting things regarding him, regarding what people claim. In fact, I've spoken to some individuals who say that they witnessed his miracles. And if I take both, and I'm speaking for myself, if I take
Yeah.
both at face value, if I assume I was in the CJ that's before you today was in the crowd watching the Red Sea split, and I assume the CJ that's with you today was in the crowd watching William Branham turn George Smith's water into wine in his one cup. One of those things is like, okay, I don't really have the opportunity to verify the first. Really, only he and George know that, because it's not a clear cup. And in the former, I literally just watched the Red Sea split open. And so it
Yeah.
seems to me like, if I assume they're both true and put myself in each scenario, that I would be much more convinced by one than I would by the latter. And that's not even to say anything about the latter. It's just simply to say that I think the weight of one, if it is assumed to be true, is much greater than the other.
Yeah, I think though you could apply the same to a miraculous healing kind of thing, like what Syed Baba did, sort of, heal people's injuries right in front of your face, kind of thing. Like that would still apply there. But I get what you mean. It would certainly be very, very convincing evidence that the person doing this is some kind of divine messenger. Absolutely. I just think that their willingness to give up, any kind of loyalty to the divine messengers, within 5 seconds of hitting their destination, is kind of telling that, I'm not sure they actually did believe it that strongly. But I would like to just briefly touch on, like, because you brought up the firstborn death of Egyptians. Do you think that was a moral thing to do? Do you think
I do.
God acted
I
in his
do.
nature and that's a moral thing to do? Why is it
Yeah.
moral?
Well, firstly, there's sort of my standard point, which is that, assuming God exists, I don't think he's logically capable of being immoral. It's sort of like, the standard is the standard by definition. So if the standard does something, then it's the standard by definition. That aside,
Yeah,
though,
I
go
gotta
ahead.
push back on that. That just sounds like a definitional thing. Like it really just does sound like, well, it's moral because that's what I'm defining as moral.
Well, to be fair, it kind of is, but it's
Okay.
not so much I'm defining rather, as much as it is, if the kind of being which the Bible describes does exist, namely a being from which all abstracts arise, a being who has created all that is, a being who is the ultimate authority, a being who is the moral standard. If that being exists, then it kind of just is definitional that he is the standard for what is and is not moral. Now, of course, there's a different question as to whether or not that being exists, and that's a totally fair argument.
Right.
To kind of share your concern there, or not share it, but give you an example of how committed I am to this particular presupposition. I don't particularly love, even though I find it to be a great immorality, I don't particularly love when people point out just how anti-Semitic Allah is in Islam. Because it's like, okay, but if you haven't yet demonstrated reason to doubt Allah, then he's just right. You have to get to that point first, because if he's not the standard, and various apologists I think can do that. David Wood, for example, demonstrates how the Quran has a dilemma on its hands by affirming the Bible and then violating its precepts and all these sorts of things. I think there are ways in which you can do that. But if you simply run in with, hey, Allah's anti-Semitic, a Muslim could respond with, okay, well, he's God. He can do whatever he wants, right? So, but the second point, which I think is probably a little bit more to, well, actually, let me ask, is there anything you want to respond to that first before I move on to the second point? Because I think...
Well, I think it's more sort of to say that a moral action is, as you said, sort of universal, but God is killing the firstborn of everybody in Egypt, including Egyptian slaves that had nothing. The average Egyptian slave is not going to have any power over the Pharaoh. There's literally nothing they can do, even if they think that the Jewish people should go free in that story. There's literally nothing they can do. So I don't understand how it becomes moral for any agent to punish an innocent person for something they had absolutely no control over. And I do think it's worrying that that is just accepted as moral, and you get your morality from God's nature.
And we are at time.
Can we let's let CJ respond to that? I really would.
Sure.
I don't want to just
absolutely. That was my next question.
Yeah. So setting the standard argument aside then, because I think you do raise an interesting point. I think there are a couple things I would say. The first being that obviously this is considered, scripturally speaking, a penalty on the Egyptians as a nation. The question immediately arises then, okay, what about the individuals in the nation, for example, slaves, who may not actually have any, like you said, they have no power over the Pharaoh, what he wants. And there are two separate points that I think are important to make. The first is what we call federal authority or federal headship. This is not universally shared by all Christians, but at the very least, Catholics, Orthodox, Anglican, and Reformed, which is my own tradition, do speak about the concept of federal headship. And that is to say that whether we like it or not, those who are in command of households, states, nations, and so forth ultimately do place their own successes and sins on their population. A great example of this, and it's actually a very horrible thing to think about, but it is true, is when we think of Nazi soldiers defending particularly East Germany against the Soviets. It is a well-established fact that at least 2 million German women and girls were raped as plunder by the Soviets, who did so not only as a means of rewarding their soldiers, but as a means of breaking German morale. Now, suppose that you are a soldier in that period, and you're not actually a Nazi. You're for sure putting on the Nazi uniform to defend your homeland and to defend your daughter or your wife or whatever it happens to be from those marauders, right? Now, this is not to say that what they did is correct. The point of bringing all that up is to say all of that whole context only exists because of the decisions of Adolf Hitler, right? Because he's the leader, because he's the one in command, you are now forced to potentially pick up a rifle and defend a Nazi flag. Because if you don't, there's a soldier who's going to break in and do something to your 14-year-old. You know what I mean? And that's just a necessary reality of life, unfortunately, that those who are in charge, ultimately our successes are going to be placed upon those who are under our stewardship, and our sins and our flaws and those things are going to be passed on to those under our stewardship. The second point, though, is that God actually, even despite that reality, does offer a way out. And we see this not only in that he commands Moses to tell everyone, put the blood on your doorposts, and anybody who I see the blood on the doorpost, not just Israelites, I will pass over them. But we actually get from the text of Exodus that a good deal of non-Israelites did, because when they leave Egypt, it is said that they came out with a mixed multitude, right? In other words, not everybody who was coming out of Egypt was an Israelite. Presumably there would be Cushites, and presumably there would be Lydians, and presumably there would be Egyptians, and so on and so forth. In fact, the Talmud records a very interesting tradition where it is said that the Torah, when it fell upon Mount Sinai, was spoken in every language of the crowd, because it was not simply Israelites who were in the crowd, right? So we kind of have two things going on there. And now the Talmud is just a tradition. It's not necessarily found in the Bible, but they are building that off of this idea that there was a mixed multitude according to the story. We kind of have these two things going on, right? Where on one end, unfortunately, it is simply a reality that the sins and successes both of those who are in charge, ultimately, the consequences of that is passed down to the people they are in charge of. And secondarily, God, working around that fact, actually did offer those who are under Pharaoh's stewardship a means of getting out of it. And we happen to know, if the story can be believed, that a good deal of them did.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, Jim. Go for it.
You guys want to do your closings?
Yeah, who started? I think CJ started, so do we
CJ
bookend
started.
it?
I was going to
person
let
started
you
goes
go
last.
first this time, Mark, since
Yeah,
that's usually the way it
that's
goes. Yeah.
bookending. Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Jim.
All right. Yep.
So, like so just in closing, I think there is a naturalistic explanation to why morality is the way it is and how we try to achieve a more moral society by what our goals are. And I would say that the desires of people, what they want, are generally, and I use this word ubiquitous because it's not universal. A person can want power and things like that, and they're not necessarily irrational. They are a rational person, but theirs isn't in alignment with everybody else's. But I think generally people do want to have a good life with community, treat others well, and a lot of it does come to empathy and things like that. I think that when challenged with where does the morality come from, appealing to God's nature, it doesn't cover it for me, because really I'm asking that, will you have a code of morality? And that morality has to be formed from somewhere. And if it does go back to God's nature as the origin point of that code of conduct for yourself, it's in God's nature to seriously harm people, to kill innocent people, to do all of these things. So it seems to me that it's more derived from what God says. And when you sort of get to, well, God is the authority, the Hume's guillotine comes up again, which is why you ought to follow God if he is commanding these things, which is sort of a lurking or a hidden ought. Why ought you follow a God that commands you to do these things? So I think that sort of, if God acts within his nature, and his nature is to viciously kill people and do all of these horrible things as described in the Old Testament, as described in, some of the books that we have, or, if it's in his nature to torture people for not believing in him, then I don't think, I would really push back that you're not getting your moral code from his nature and are rather getting it from somewhere else, presumably God's commandments. Because if you did get your moral code from his nature, it would be more reflective of his nature, which does include all of these things. I think that sort of saying, hey, he has the authority to convey which parts of his nature you should do, that's fine. I completely understand that. But then you are getting it from his commands, not his nature. I think that the naturalistic way sort of really does cover the consequences of things. Do we want to live in a society where an authority can just take life? And I think that if all people, if people in that society say no, then that becomes an ethical standard provided by their morality to sort of say, we do not want to live in this society. We do have to contend with atrocities being done, and the example came up of what the Russians did to the Germans, and I would argue that isn't moral either. I would argue that I don't want to live in a society where soldiers attack civilians. So that is immoral to do, whether they are on my side or on the enemy's side. And that is why we prosecute Australian soldiers for war crimes that they have done while at war, because I do not want to live in that society. mostly because I'm a civilian and I don't want anything bad happening to me, but also because I don't want to see bad things happening to others. So I do not think that a people or a leader doing wrong in some way allows for a immoral thing to happen to their people. I think that morality is much more selective about punishment than that. And I think that if you can say, well, God can relay to people that certain actions are moral, regardless of how it impacts society, regardless of how it impacts others, then I would argue that you are setting up for people to do things that are reprehensible in society under the cover of, well, God commanded me to do it. And unfortunately, we see far too much of this, not only from Christianity, but from Islam, from Hindu, from all different religions, where somebody will lean on the authority of God in order to justify really horrible actions, whether that's God told me to run for president, or God told me to blow up a plane, or God showed me a miracle to do that. Thank you, and thank you very much for having me.
CJ, you ready?
Yes, sir.
All right, go ahead.
All right, so I want to first thank everybody involved in tonight's conversation. Thank you, of course, to Mr. Reid for inviting me to have this debate. It was actually rather excellent. I think that you're a very sharp individual and philosophically inclined, which I don't always get in conversations, and I'm sure you can say the same in terms of not always getting it. So hopefully I reciprocated, and this, I think, was an excellent conversation. Also, it's my first time on, I believe this channel is called Skeptic Haven, but it says Thought Experiment up here too. So I guess I'm not sure which one it is. Anyway, it's my first time on the channel. You have been a wonderful moderator. Mr. Barrows, I believe your name is. And so thank you very much for your participation in hosting and moderating this debate. And then to the audience, thank you guys also for your participation in listening. I understand that this is probably skeptic dominated. I wouldn't say everybody, but obviously in the same way Standing for Truth is a Christian channel, this is a more skeptical channel. And so I recognize that, that this might be the quote unquote enemy territory, intellectually speaking, but I have been looking over at the live chat and you guys have actually been rather great yourselves. So thank you also for your participation in listening. I want to, as I always do, quote Proverbs 27 in two places. The first being the second verse. Let someone else praise you and not your own mouth, an outsider and not your own lips. So whether you were on my side or not initially, if you felt that I had good arguments here today, if they convinced you, if it's something you didn't have to think about, you please be the one to say so. That lets me know which arguments are stronger, which arguments I need to work on more. And on that second point, verse 17 says, as iron sharpens iron, so one sharpens another. So on the flip side, if you had arguments that you thought were particularly bad, again, please do be the one to say so. I think that criticism is actually a very good thing. My goal is truth. And of course, being a Christian theist, the glorification of God. And so I appreciate those who help me in accomplishing those things by way of their commentary. A couple brief points regarding what I think came about in this debate. Now, to be fair, we ended up focusing so much on a few arguments that a lot of the arguments went unanswered simply because of lack of time. So I don't want to, like, for example, hold Mark accountable for not answering my moral argument from objective morality, because the reality is I didn't really press that either in the open discussion or in the cross-examination. But even in the points which we did press, I think that we were able to reach a couple of conclusions that argue for the theist side. For example, I think we were able to establish fairly reasonably that the argument regarding, well, God can just command whatever it is that he commands, and that's considered moral, is just kind of a definitional problem. If, in fact, he is the standard, then the standard is what the standard is. The only argument, therefore, is whether or not he is, in fact, the standard. But that argument is ultimately a question regarding, does he exist, and not an argument regarding whether or not he grounds morality. If a being such as what is described in the Bible or any of the other monotheistic holy books does exist, then we just simply have to conclude that that being is the standard for morality, because that's the very nature, it's definitional regarding this being. I think we also were able to see in this debate, and we actually heard it a little bit in the concluding statement there, a point regarding why this authority argument is so important. Recall that I said I am a divine command theorist in every pragmatic way, but believe that commands are ultimately grounded in God's nature, meaning that I think human beings best understand morality by way of God's commands, right? And we did hear Mark say in his closing that it is perfectly possible for a God to say you're going to adhere to certain elements of my nature, but not all of them. But therefore, that means that we're getting our morality from his commands and not from his nature. I think that fits very well with the paradigm that I have described here, which is that I understand my moral oughts and ought nots most clearly and most objectively by way of what God has commanded me. But if pressed philosophically to ground what God has commanded me in something, I believe those commands are ultimately grounded in his nature. It does not mean that I am commanded to obey the totality of his nature or to emulate the totality of his nature, would probably be a better way to put it. It simply means that those things which I have been commanded to do or not to do are ultimately grounded in his nature, which I think both answers the Euthyphro dilemma and also answers this question as to why he might be able to morally do something that I am not able to morally do. There are a couple other points that I think I would like to bring up, but of course we're relatively short of time, so I just want to say once again, thank you all. This was a fantastic conversation, and I look forward to having another in the future. Perfect timing. Wow, that was
Yeah,
That was
well
smooth.
time very, very well. All right, folks. We do now have about 30 minutes where chat, yes, all of you folks in chat can ask questions. And CJ, the channel is Skeptic Haven. The show is The Thought Experiment because we do multiple shows. This is just one of those. And
Yeah, we're sort of looking at off Skeptic Haven. So the new channel is Thought Experiment. We're kind of, using a current base to sort of, get it rolling, but it's been really good. The crew are fantastic. I would sing its praises.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Appreciate that. So we have a question. This one is for Mark, and it's tangential a little bit. They would, Aunt Jer would like you to finish the story about the Capchasans and the cake, the monkeys and the cake, and I believe it was fairness.
The capuchin monkeys. Yeah. So
Capuchins,
if
yes.
basically, yeah, the researcher would give one capuchin monkey a cucumber, and they don't mind cucumber; they'll eat it. And so the first one eats the cucumber. The second one returns the stone that's in an adjacent cage, and they get a grape, which capuchin monkeys absolutely love. That's their favorite food. They love grapes. It's like crack to these things. It's terrible. But basically, then they request the first one that got the cucumber to return the stone, and then give it cucumber, the okay food. And the capuchin monkey, which did eat the cucumber first off, throws it back at the researcher and chucks an absolute tantrum. The reason why is because the second one is getting a grape, which it feels is unfair, right? It's doing the same work of returning the stone, and it is not getting the same reward. It just has this sense of inherent unfairness for that. And that is reciprocity. It's sort of a empathic feeling where we feel outraged when something is not consistent across our society because the rewards are not the same for people doing the same things. And evolutionarily speaking, it is a useful mechanism to stop into sort of competition and sort of inequity across the society in order to have a more harmonious society, a less volatile society.
CJ, did you want to comment, add?
Yeah, I would add a few things, and I'll be very brief with it. The first being that I actually I don't deny that well, first of all, I don't deny that monkeys do this, of course, because we have solid evidence that they do. But even just, I own 2 dogs, and they're huskies, and they're very pack oriented, and you can definitely see a very primitive level of understanding of fairness in them, of understanding of. I think their understanding of what is right and wrong has a lot to do with A, preserving the pack, and B, doing what I tell them. But there's something there, it may not be as inherent as it is with a human, and it does eventually carry on, such that I can have a camera here and they won't do things that I tell them not to do, even when I'm not here, or when they do, they'll even try to hide it, which is particularly interesting. So I wouldn't deny any of that. My question, I think, though, and this is the point where I want to end it, is reciprocity is actually very often not considered the end all be all of morality. In fact, we typically expect individuals, if not expect, we reward individuals who go out of their way to be unfair, but in the other direction, right? So to use the capuchin monkeys as an example, if we saw a monkey getting the grape and giving his grape to the other monkey, that which is not fair. He ultimately now does not have a grape, but he's been kind to the other. We tend to see that as actually a great moral good. And my question would be, while we can get to a sort of selfish reciprocity, and I don't even use the word selfish there in a negative light, but simply to say it is focused on oneself, we can get that simply from looking at animals. Where do we get to the selfless unfairness that we tend to reward in our societies? Things like charity and adoption and so on and so forth. I don't think that you can get that from naturalistic means, but I'm interested if somebody can provide an argument for that.
Okay.
Can I finish it? The question was to me. Usually, the format is like whoever is asked
sure,
the question
go ahead.
finishes the thing. I think that you get that from empathy. And yeah, you're absolutely right. There is sort of there was another experiment with parrots, I believe, and they were given money to buy food, and one of the parrots would be given this money to buy food, and the other one wasn't, and the parrot actually passed its money through the cage to the other parrot so it could buy food, which shows a unique not unique selflessness to animals in general. It's not just humans that care about other animals. I think, though, I would really push back on, well, where, and I totally agree with you, CJ. I think this is sort of a proto-morality. It's sort of doesn't rise to the level of a code of conduct, but it definitely is showing the traits that go into our moral decisions, in my opinion. But I think that I would push back and sort of say, well, where did these animals that, have never read the Bible, or, they obviously, I don't know if they believe in God, but, how is the transmission of what is moral to these monkeys or the parrot kind of thing? Is it okay if I let CJ answer that one? Jim?
Sure. This is pretty free
because I have
form.
asked a question. Okay.
So I do think that's a good question. I'm not familiar with that parrot experiment, so I'd like to definitely look it up for myself. That being said, I'm not doubting it. I'm just simply saying I'm not familiar.
Fair enough.
So in regards to, where does this sort of proto-morality come from? I would argue, the Hebrew word used for creature, not animal per se, but creature, is nephesh, which happens to be the same word that's used for a soul. I would argue, kind of along the lines of Dr. Hugh Ross, that animals in the Bible are meant to be soul-ish. That is to say that there is traits of humanity that is recognizable in them without being human nature itself. I think this is most clearly seen in apes and dogs. Dogs because they share a similar family structure to us, and apes because they share similar intellectual levels. But it's certainly seen in other creatures as well. And I do think it's something that the Bible does mean to communicate. I would also, kind of guesstimate, because there's no way to prove this, but being that I do think that Yehovah exists, I would suspect that animals do have some knowledge of him, whatever that happens to mean. Very rudimentary, very primitive, I have no doubt about that. But I would suspect that they have some knowledge of him, such that, like, if Jesus walked in my front door right now, I think that my dogs would recognize him. But that is an assumption that I have as a theist that is grounded in very little other than the fact that I think that God exists and created them as well. So I recognize that somebody might see that as maybe not as convincing as I do.
Okay. Are you both finished that? And we can move on to the
Yeah,
next
yeah, that's
one.
fine.
Okay.
That's fine. No
All
worries.
right.
Thank you.
The infamous godless engineer has given us $5 for this question, so I will take that one out of order. Can both parties on their own moral foundations condemn or condone 1 Samuel 15, 1 through 3?
So I'll take that first. First of all, how's it going, Godless? We've had a few debates ourselves, and it's a pleasure to see you here again. I would yes, condone or condemn. I'd say condone, actually. 1 Samuel 15 is the story of Samuel. God commands Samuel to tell Saul to wipe out the Amalekites. Going back to my standard point that I made earlier, I don't think God is even logically capable of having an immoral command. If he is truly the being that the Bible describes, what he says is moral by definition. But to expound upon that a little bit, I think that God is perfectly within his rights. And in fact, if justice truly exists and if it's truly a part of his nature, we might even say, in a manner of speaking, obligated. I don't think anything outside of God obligates him, but his own nature might obligate him to punish wickedness. And I think the wholesale destruction of societies is something that he occasionally does do, and I think he's fully justified in doing so. And I would even go as far as to say I think he still does do so. He may not command individuals to do this or that thing. I think that was pretty unique to the Israelites and the Israelites alone, being that they had a special relationship with God. But I think God wipes out civilizations all the time for their evil deeds. And sometimes, as per Isaiah 10, he uses evil empires to wipe out evil empires. For example, in Assyria 10, he uses Assyria to crush the Israelites for their wickedness. And then he then immediately turns around and crushes the Assyrians for their wickedness. And I think you could, if I were postulating, I could say it's entirely possible that God used the Spanish to crush the Aztecs without them having any intention to be righteous, by the way. They can still be wicked in doing this. It's entirely possible that God used them to crush the Aztecs and then crush them for what they did to the Aztecs. I think given what we see in Isaiah chapter 10, that's perfectly reasonable. But to answer the question, yeah, in 1 Samuel 15, I think that God is justified and just in judging his creation as he sees fit. And that includes entire civilizations, which I believe he does frequently all throughout history.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. This is really interesting from John. So I wasn't really familiar, so I did have to look it up. I will confess that straight away. But that's the Amalekites, and so it's a very interesting question because obviously it violates my morality. I don't think you should be genociding anybody because, and the reason why may be a bit roundabout in the way that I reason that. It's because I'm interested in humans surviving and flourishing. The universe is a very hostile place. Now that we know how hostile it is, not only is it it behooves us to be aware of that, but also that we may need everybody. The best survival chance comes with everybody working together, which obviously humans have not had a great track record with, and is why I advocate for it. But I think that in form of their goals and the way that I view morality, if the goal is to create a strong Israelite nation, then it's even immoral by their standard, because the best way is to sort of come to compromises with people, like find common ground, and then expand the society. We see this all the time. Basically, it was individual tribes, and then they become sort of nations, then they become bigger states. We see this all the time. The way to have a truly strong survival rate is to work together, cooperation, not conflict. So we see this all the time. This is backed up by game theory, which sort of says cooperation is way more effective than conflict in any situation. But this is also the one where I believe Saul doesn't do what God wants, and he sort of keeps some of the livestock and things like that, because, you know, obviously if you want to create a strong Israel, that's the way to do it. But God sort of sends somebody to say, no, that's immoral. You've got to put everything to the sword. You've got to kill everything. So I think that it depends. If you're, it's obviously immoral to me. If your intention is to expand the glory of God or something like that, then it may be moral by their standard. It may be moral. But I think that if your intention, as most of the Bible, is to, you know, give Israelites a strong nation that is unassailable, then it's a really immoral decision. You ought not to do that to get to a strong nation. And I think that there were people there, the Kenites, yeah, they said sort of, you know, leave the Amalekites or we'll destroy you too. A much better option would be to meet with them and create a stronger nation together.
CJ, do you want to respond or?
Well, I would just ask a question, which is because you gave two examples. You know, is it for the glory of God or the glory of Israel, to kind of paraphrase? But the answer I gave, which I think is probably the more classical answer, is that it was judgment on the Amalekites. So not necessarily for Israel per se, and though it does ultimately glorify God, not necessarily for the glory of God per se, but for the punishment of that which is wicked. And so my question regarding that would be, hypothetically, like, I don't know if you like comic books, but there's a guy who wrote this comic book. I can't remember his name, but he also wrote The Boys, where like there's this disease that puts an X on everybody's face, and they just get completely rabid and they start, you know, sexually assaulting each other and eating each other and all this kind of stuff. I really wish I could remember the name, because it's kind of a horrifying comic, but it's also an interesting philosophical read in a way. Anyway, the point is, in such, like, assuming even a society that bad that just got to the point where they were constantly doing everything terrible to. Say again?
I think that comic book is crossed. I know the one you're talking
Yes,
about.
that is exactly
I apologize for interrupting you, but I thought I'd answer that one real quick.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's totally good, and you're exactly right. It is crossed, and like, do you think, assuming there is a God, do you think he's justified in even wiping out that society, or would you take the position that just the wholesale destruction of a society is not justified?
I think the wholesale destruction of a society is not justified, particularly in this case, because yes, it may be morally necessary to, you know, fight a war against a people because you are under threat, or they are, you know, in the case of Crossed, you're obviously talking about, you know, absolutely rabid people that are, you know, incredibly destructive. I totally understand that, but we're talking about killing not only the adults, but also the children, the babies, the animals. Like, I cannot see why that would be morally necessary in order to achieve a goal of, you know, safety for your people, or, you know, having some sort of, you know, security in the area kind of thing. I think that those two things are completely different. And while we may take actions that we do not wish to, and we ought to, for our security and safety, I think that's a long stretch away from, you know, genociding an entire people. I think that when we do things that are, you know, we ordinarily wouldn't want to do, we don't do them with this sort of delight or enjoyment or things like that. We only do them because they're absolutely necessary. And I think there has to be boundaries on the actions that we take in these examples, because the problem with sort of this kind of attack is that reciprocity, again, people will turn around and attack you as well. And then I think I really do like the way that Nelson Mandela approached the wrongs done to the South African black people that were the victims of apartheid. And he spent 30 years in a prison, or almost 30 years in a prison, and then came out and forgave all of the people, because he knew that taking revenge on them would simply continue a cycle of violence. And I think that he was very prescient with that. I think that of all the ways South Africa could have gone, it actually is fantastic, doing fantastically well considering how badly everything could have come out. So, no, it's a good question. It's a good question. Like, what do you do when you encounter another society that you cannot deal with in the way that I'm describing? And yeah, I think that for the safety and security of a people, you may have to do things that you don't want to do, but I think there has to be limits on that. And instead of wiping out an entire people, you could certainly, stop at a certain amount. You could imprison some, especially the babies and children. I think that they have absolutely no decisions over what their adult parents are doing. I think that that's sort of, that's where it becomes, absolutely horrendous.
Okay. We do have some more questions. So, but if you want to respond, CJ.
I think, yeah, I'll just say briefly, and because that was a very thorough answer and it was a good answer. I think that I would simply say that I almost entirely agree in terms of man, but I do think God has the authority to wipe out civilizations wholesale if He so chooses, especially provided they reach a certain, level of moral depravity. And in fact, I think He can even do so using sinful nations, like I brought up Isaiah 10. Isaiah is not somehow righteous for judging Israel or for being God's instrument to judge Israel in Isaiah 10. In fact, God Himself judges Assyria for the haughtiness of their own heart in doing what He Himself is using them to do against Israel. So there's an extent to which I think that Christians will obviously we have this high view of God that I recognize. You may not necessarily share, being that, first of all, you don't believe, and second of all, you make different assumptions regarding the God of the Bible than I do. But I think that it is. I do believe God is justified in taking what the means that He sees necessary in order to enact justice. And I would also just say briefly, I do think there's an issue here regarding our conflicting interpretations, based that is grounded in our definitions of justice. This came up a little bit earlier, but I believe justice is punitive by its very nature. You obviously do not, right? And so that's going to, I think, change the way both of us look at a question like this, where I think the punishment of evil is in and of itself a moral good. And I think you might say something along the lines of the punishment of evil is necessary to protect societies and even potentially rehabilitate those who do evil things.
Yes.
So, that's a meaningful distinction, but it's one that I think might prevent us from ever seeing eye to eye on this issue.
Okay. Mark?
No, I'm good. You've got another super
Okay.
chat from John for Godless Engineer.
Yeah, we sure do. Question. I want to interpret this a little, because the question literally is, does condone the traffic in Numbers 31:18-2?
He's saying, does CJ condone it, is what he's asking.
Yeah, that's what I believe he's saying too. I just thought I'd read it exactly that and let you folks interpret how you wish. So whoever wants to take that. I think it is directed at CJ.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I would say a couple things. First off, I think Numbers 31 is very often misunderstood. It is typically taken by skeptics as an example of sexual slavery. I do not think that is accurate. First and foremost, the context of Numbers 31 is where the reason the Israelites were falling into this pagan idolatrous worship is because the Midianites had a very common practice in ancient world known as temple prostitution. And so while to a modern reader, sparing the virgins might sound like sparing them so that you can use them as your sex puppets, in the context of that point in time, sparing the virgins is a way of saying sparing the individuals who were not actually involved in the thing that got us here in the first place. I think that's a much more reasonable interpretation, especially considering what we see in places like Deuteronomy 20 and Deuteronomy 22, where, like in Deuteronomy 20, it says if you want to make a wife of one of the captives, or if you find yourself finding one of the captives to be beautiful, you're not allowed to use her as a sexual slave. You actually are to marry her, and she's to become an Israelite, which for the time is kind of a radical thing. I know that in the modern day we might see something along those lines and say, "Oh my goodness, you're marrying these people after you just attacked their civilization." Well, everybody else is killing them or using them as sex slaves. So you can see where this actually, we're going to welcome them into the Israelite fold, is a significant improvement over actually we're just going to kill them or use them as concubines or whatever. All that being said, all that qualification being said, the question still remains, do I think that what happens in Numbers 31 is justified? And the answer actually depends on whether or not this is God's plan, to be perfectly frank. Moses commands in Numbers 31, not God himself per se. And so if this is merely Moses's command, then that might change the arithmetic versus whether or not this is God's command. Now, in either case, I do think that the Israelite moral code guaranteed that slaves were treated with a certain level of human rights that would be significantly different than what we might be used to. It may not make a modern comfortable in all of its different respects, but certainly, for example, you'll hear scholars talk about the chip the eye or gouge the tooth, or excuse me, gouge the eye or chip the tooth verse. And that's usually interpreted by scholars as a prohibition against doing serious cosmetic damage to a slave lest they go free, right? So there's a significant difference, I think, between slavery is condoned in the Bible. There's no doubt about that. I think that when people try to argue against that, they're pissing against the wind, to be honest with you. But the slavery that is described in the Bible does allow the slave a certain level of human rights that is virtually unheard of in any other society that had legal slavery. So I do think that there are things in the Mosaic law that ensure that these people are going to be treated well. If they are going to be married, then if they are going to be sleeping with captives and they're going to be married, they're going to be considered Israelites. They are not going to be, you're not allowed to sell them into slavery if you end up getting a divorce, so on and so forth. This is all in Deuteronomy 20. Also, if they are slaves, they are to be treated with a certain level of human dignity that you don't find in other slave societies, and so on and so forth. So there are parameters within the law of Moses that are designed to make sure slaves and captives and so on and so forth are treated with a level of dignity that is almost unheard of throughout human history, with the exception of very, very recent human history.
Yeah, I would sort of say that in the verse it sort of says like the distinction of every woman that hasn't, every girl that hasn't slept with a man. I think that sort of lends credibility to what most historians say is they were taking them as plunder, plus they are listed in the plunder kind of thing. But I want to focus on the idea that God allowed Moses without any sort of recrimination to do this and kill every single male. So that's one of the telling things, that it doesn't matter the age of the male or whether they're a virgin or anything like that. It matters whether the girls are. So I think that lends credibility to historians that say, hey, they were being taken. They may not have been sort of, our traditional idea of a sex slave, but they certainly were being taken against their will as new potential wives in the Jewish tribes. And I do find exception at, and it's not really CJ's fault, but when you sort of say, well, yeah, it was slavery, but better slavery than was around at the time. And don't get me wrong, I don't do presentism for history. I don't sort of say, hey, those people should have known better, because oftentimes in our story of how we arrived at our moral structures, people didn't know better. They thought that was the norm. They thought that was fine. I would strongly disagree and say that it's not good for anybody. But I don't sort of say, hey, they should have known better. It's like saying, well, they should have known how to build an aeroplane. They didn't. So I don't engage in that presentism, but I think that a God should have known that that is a horrible thing to do when you are, killing an entire people, killing, some little girl's brother, and then against her will dragging her back to your tribe to be assimilated into that tribe against their will. I don't think that's the right thing to do, and I think that a God would know that. So I don't blame the people, but the God didn't say to Moses, that was really wrong what you did. In fact, there's certain points where he said, why didn't you kill everybody, like the Numbers passage that we saw before. So yeah, I think it's still incredibly wrong. CJ, you can have the last word, mate.
Yeah, I would just say that I think, well, actually, I won't say anything. I'll just offer, if you or Godless Engineer or anybody else is interested in debating a more specific element of biblical morality, such as slavery or something like that, I am perfectly willing. And obviously, no pressure if nobody wants to, but just to say that, I'm willing to do that if you guys are interested. And we'll kind of leave it at that.
Okay. CJ, there's a private chat and in there are some questions. Since we're going to wind it up, I thought I would let either of you, if you see one in there that is interesting, and Godless Engineer John did have a follow-up question as well that you can take, but we are running up against time. So I don't know if some of these might be palate cleansers because they're not nearly as serious as what we just discussed, and some are not. And then there's John's follow-up as well.
I do like Bree's steelmanning question. Which do you think is the strongest argument? I do like it when people steelman. I think it's shows good faith, to be honest with you. But CJ, if that's okay with you,
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I can go first.
Sure.
I think that sort of probably the strongest is sort of the objection about moral anti-realism. It seems to be intuitively to us to say, morality can't just be stance dependent or subjective kind of thing. It seems wrong to say that. It seems intuitively wrong because we want to clamp down on things that we see as immoral with authority. And I totally understand why that does seem counterintuitive and doesn't seem right, if you will. I've sort of arrived at that decision but I think it's a very strong argument. And the question does arise, how do I argue against another society that may believe in completely the opposite to me? Like, what kind of authority do I take to tell them, hey, that is wrong? And that's definitely something that I've struggled with. That's definitely something that it annoys the hell out of me, to be honest with you. I would like there to be an objective morality that I can say, hey, this is the morality of the universe, independent from human thought or positions or stances. I just cannot see that. And I cannot resolve that exists. But it is a really good argument against it, because then how do I go and tell another person that their morality is wrong? I think that it's easier in society. I can just sort of go, well, I think you're wrong. But at a certain point, you have to acknowledge that if two nations completely disagree about morality, they may devolve into fighting it out. And that is not what I want to have happen. It's not but when you get into a war, sometimes it's not your choice. So yeah, it's a really good point.
So this is an interesting question for me, because I think that the best argument I tend to hear regarding God justifying morality is not it's not an argument against the proposition per se. And I don't say that in an insulting way. I just say it because this is the one that genuinely has the most impact on me. And it's similar to what we were just talking about, actually, with regards to things like, I did a debate with David Paulman. We were talking about the slaughter of the Canaanites. And the question was asked in the live chat, how would you feel if you knew for an indisputable fact that God had commanded you to be one of the soldiers in that army? And I stumbled a little bit because, to be perfectly reasonable with you, I'm a little bit of a squish. I've never even shot an animal before, and I don't want to. Let alone the idea of a person, especially a small person like a child. It's not something that I'm able to square perfectly in my head. Now, the reason I say that that's not an argument against the proposition is because the reality, in my opinion, is that a God might command those things actually does nothing to dissuade or persuade one way or the other me to say God can or is the grounding for morality. I think they're ultimately just fundamentally different questions. But it is still the argument that I find myself being most impacted by, because I am particularly averse to violence. So I know that might surprise people, considering that I've developed a little bit of a reputation as being gung-ho as it pertains to things like slavery and stuff like that, just saying, yep, that's what's commanded, therefore. But it's weird. I'll be perfectly honest with you, it's weird. I just don't think there's any way to get around it, because there is, for me, it's like this, okay, either God commanded it, in which case it's right to do, and my aversion to it in some way is probably steeped in something that is also coming from God, or he didn't, in which case it's kind of just up in the air. I might not like it, but somebody else might like it, and they can kind of do whatever they wish, which I guess goes a little bit to Mark's point to an extent, although I don't want to caricature it, so that's not. But that's I think the biggest thing that actually provides a genuine gut punch for me is like, okay, CJ, imagine yourself in the Israelite army. Do you think you would be capable of carrying out the kinds of commands that God says, even if you knew indisputably it was God? It's like, I don't know if I could shoot a deer, to be real. So it's a good question, and it certainly serves its rhetorical purpose.
Okay. And I believe that brings us to the end of our show. I'd like to thank both of our interlocutors, Mark and CJ, for joining us, and all of you as well. Stay tuned to the channel, because on Sunday, we have Godless Engineer, who's in chat with us today, and Felicia on our show, Let's Talk. On Tuesdays with Alan and Elliott, we have Deconversionists. And on Thursday with AJ, we have Critical Call. So not only do we do this, but we have other shows as well. So stay tuned. And we will see you on our next show.
Thank you. Thanks, CJ. Thanks, Jim.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Thought Experiment, the arena where religion, politics, and philosophy step into the ring and ideas get tested. Here, we don't dodge the hard questions. We confront them. We weigh arguments, challenge assumptions, and follow the evidence wherever it leads. If you enjoy sharp thinking and honest debate, you're in the right place. Like the video if you found it thought-provoking, subscribe so you never miss a debate, and most importantly, tell us in the comments